And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Hello again, and thanks for tuning into the podcast once again. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm the Director of TeachThought Professional Development, and I'm happy to have you join us for what we try to do, which is to have heterodox and complex and interesting and sometimes difficult conversations about things that will hopefully help you as an educator better prepare students for the modern world. Speaking of preparing students for the modern world, our professional development services are, of course, all geared towards that, and everything that we do is through the lens of inquiry and personalized to meet the needs of you and your school and your district. So if you are looking for ways to better prepare your students for the modern world, please navigate on over to wegrowteachers.com, where you'll find our workshops and our services, including project-based learning, differentiated instruction, and a whole host of inquiry-centered and student-focused professional development options for your school. In this episode, I spoke with Jennifer LaGarde and Darren Hudgins, who are authors of a book called Developing Digital Detectives: Essential Lessons for Discerning Fact From Fiction in the Fake News Era. Obviously, this is fairly contextually topical in this age and in this era, as students and adults are struggling with information and media literacy. So we talked about the process and the steps and lessons that they have in the book, touched on the differences between mis and dis and malinformation, the sources that use advertising to provide revenue, and thus the information that we get from them is essentially free, but there's a cost to that, of course, as well as a subscription model outlets like New York Times or Wall Street Journal, and the factors involved there like audience capture, access, and the ways in which economics plays into that model. And then we touched also on the ways in which the processes that they show in the book can help teachers and some of the complexities around doing so in dealing with sort of controversial or tribalistic pieces of information on one side or the other. So certainly an interesting and important conversation and process and work to be having students and really adults doing. So I hope you find it helpful. All right, well, welcome to the podcast. I'm here with Jennifer LaGarde and Darren Hudgins, and we're going to talk about their new book, Developing Digital Detectives: Essential Lessons for Discerning Fact from Fiction in the Fake News Era, and certainly something that I think is needed and unfortunately necessary. But before we get into the conversation, Jennifer, why don't you give our listeners a little bit of background on who you are and the work that I suppose you have been doing and are doing and brought you to this point in your professional career.
Sure. Hi, everyone. And Drew, thank you so much for having us. You know, I feel like I tag a lot of my posts on social media with the hashtag Lucky Librarian, because I do feel like I'm the luckiest librarian in the cut out there. I currently work at Rutgers University. I teach pre-service librarians courses like emerging literacy, young adult literature, information literacy, etc. But I spent over 20 years in public education, working as an English teacher, then a school librarian, then a digital teaching and learning specialist, both at a district level and at the state level. And I've just been so fortunate to be able to really follow my passions throughout my career, which includes both helping kids growing up in poverty develop a love of reading, and then most recently information and news and media literacy, which has brought me to this wonderful partnership with my friend and co-conspirator Darren Hudgins.
All right, and you have a previous book with Darren as well, right?
Yes, Fact versus Fiction, which is similar topic, but a different take on it. And that book came out in 2018. It's not a prequel to Digital Detectives in any way, but the two books do work together.
Okay. Darren, how about you?
Well, I as well, and thank you for allowing me to be here. I'm really excited. I have kind of I call it a 3-act play kind of life. I did, or I got the opportunity to do 11 years as a social studies. We used to call it vocational ed, but CTE teacher, and where I got to dive into all kinds of different things here. And then I've spent about 10 to 11 years in the ed tech kind of community, running events, workshops, keynotes, all kinds of different things. And then now this act, I don't know if it's going to be the last act or how that works, but I own my own company called Think, Do, Thrive, where I am doing a myriad of things, but some of those things from the past, the social studies and the CTE piece, obviously spending time in ed tech and running events and doing keynotes and workshops and things like that. But most recently, spending a lot of time also in social emotional learning. It goes without saying, being here with Jennifer and you, media and information literacy, and just a myriad of other leadership things and stuff. And it's too long of a list to tell you all of it, but really, really excited to be here. My take and what I tell people all the time, back to your fact versus fiction and developing digital detectives, is it is really a progression of Jennifer and I's thoughts over the last 4 to 5 years. If anything, fact versus fiction is kind of the what and the why. It was like our calling to hey, this has been around for a long time, but it's really been amplified, and we're all experiencing that now. And then developing digital detectives is really our how, because we had, even though we addressed it in the first book, we didn't, I think, maybe give as large of a roadmap. We were more kind of call to action. We need to do this. Whereas developing digital detectives is really our 2.5 year long haul of how, because we got so much feedback from folks. So
yeah, I was just going to add to that and say that when after Fact versus Fiction came out, Darren and I, spent a lot of those 2 years that followed doing PD with teachers and librarians and administrators around the world to address this problem. And what we found was that what they really wanted was how to do this, resources. They got it. This is an issue. They got to do something about it. But how do we do it? And so when the pandemic hit, and even before that, that gave us an opportunity, once we were grounded literally at home, like everyone else, to sort of take everything that we've learned and these requests from teachers and create a resource that hopefully will fill that gap for them. So that was kind of the goal of that book, and we're delighted now that people have it. Yeah,
and so there's several places we could start. Certainly, maybe just in some ways you've done it already, but sort of an elevator pitch of the book, and you've got basically sort of outlined a set of processes that are, and I think you're calling them lenses. Looks like 4 lenses, and then some examples for elementary, middle, and high school. Some lessons as you put them, and steps. I think is 10 steps, sort of to try to guide teachers through the process, right? So maybe a little bit more on the why. It seems somewhat apparent to me, and probably to listeners, as anybody who's paying attention to media, social media, and all of the accompanying pieces that go along with that. But what's the maybe the why, not just for creating this book, but for teachers to, I guess, use it in their classrooms?
Well, I'll go ahead and start and say first that, the Pew Research Center does a poll every several years asking people what they feel are the most pressing issues facing, since Pew is centered in the United States, facing Americans, and every few years when that poll comes out, that some of the same issues that they change in order, but things like climate change are on that list, and the fight for racial justice, poverty, income inequality, crime, all of those things. And what I believe, and I know I speak for Darren when I say this, even though I try not to speak for Darren Hudgins very often, is that we believe that all of those issues have one thing in common, and that is that they are fueled and made worse and also harder to solve by the presence of misdis and malinformation in the conversation and discourse around them. So we find ourselves at a paralyzed, just completely unable to deal with some of these major crises that we're facing as a species because our discourse and our understanding is polluted by content that's been created to not only manipulate and influence us, but in some cases harm us. As far as teachers go, I think now more than ever, educators feel an urgency to deal with this issue because it's landing at their doorstep. School board meetings are becoming these boxing ring arenas, these cage matches between often misinformed communities and educators who are trying to survive during probably one of the hardest last couple of years in education, and policies are influenced by that. And of course, now these things are coming to classrooms where educators are being asked to think about the materials that they use, et cetera, based on the desires of communities who have been misinformed about what teachers are trying to do. So I think more than ever, educators feel that sense of urgency, and it has to start with the kids we have now, along with our colleagues, if we have any hope of being able to sort of right this ship.
Okay, Darren, anything you want to add to that, since she spoke for you?
No, she always does, and we bounce things off each other. This is how this wonderful relationship works. I mean, just a side note, I told you I was a social studies teacher. I didn't spend a lot of time with my librarian, and Jennifer was an English teacher and librarian, and she didn't spend a ton of time. And we're just like, we need to merge together. We all need to work together. And to Jennifer's point, when we were working on this book, all these things were happening. And I'm saying the second book, obviously things that happened prior, but we thought at the time that, global fires was like the biggest thing. And it was all over the news and all this stuff was happening. And then it was just like it was just like the next thing. And we've gotten into, you had all of these social justice movements, you had this massive polarization, not that hasn't been going on for a long time, but it's been scaled. Just one thing after another. And we're like, people are using these things to manipulate you pick the topic, whether that's financial gain, whether that's power, whether that's dominion over other, on down the line, natural resources. And so we were just like, you know what, facts matter. Like, this is a big deal. We have to empower folks to help them make decisions, because throughout history, generation after generation has kicked the can on things. And we're kind of coming to this moment where we're going to have to make some real decisions on how we want our communities, our society, whether that's local, regional, global, how we want them to go. And we want them to be based on facts. And if we don't teach kids how to critically think, if we teach them like we used to, which was just look for little indicators, and that's just going to solve it. If we don't get them to really process and think and understand how things are going, then I don't know. I feel like that's a hopeless world, because we're just guessing, or we're being, again, manipulated. And I could go on and on and on, but we're just, that was our real why. And I think if you're in education and you're trying to empower kids, give them the best life that's possible, all those kinds of things, then you have to start with being able to have critical conversations, being able to start with truth, all this stuff that Jennifer brought up as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned sort of how we used to do things, and use the word indicators, or little indicators. And I'm curious what What are those things? Like when we used to, are you talking about like how we used to have them, read for comprehension or pick pieces out or diagram things, or what is it that you're referring to there?
I'm going to give this to Jennifer because this is one that she gets all fired up. So watch out, Drew. You just opened up a can of I don't know, can of digital detective. How about that?
No. I love that you asked this question though, Drew, because this is something that I feel like is an important part of the conversation that we've only begun to sort of scratch the surface on. And that is that information literacy is not a new discipline. People think about, quote, fake news and news and media literacy being a new form of education based on our reliance on the internet for internet consumption. But reality is that people have been thinking about news and information literacy for as long as we've had a media. And many of the most popular tools that are continue to be used in classrooms have been around for decades and decades and decades. These tools, I'm talking about things like the CRAP test, the CARS checklist, the RADCAB model. Educators listening to this will recognize those acronyms. These are checklists that have been created to help learners identify markers of credibility within a piece of information. All of these tools have one thing in common, and besides being a checklist, and that is that they were created long before things like the first smartphone, things like Facebook, things like YouTube, TikTok, etc. They were created by people who had the same goals in mind that Darren and I have, which is to help learners be better at parsing credibility in the information that they consume in mass on a daily basis. But the people who created these tools could not have conceived of a world in which we were all carrying around powerful computers in our pockets and getting our information not from vetted journalists, but from crowdsourced apps. And so using these tools, it's not that these tools are bad, they're just no longer up to the task. And so what we wanted to do was create a protocol, these lenses that you mentioned before, that fill the gaps, that take kids on an investigative process that requires them to focus more on asking questions and necessarily finding the answer to a binary, like, is this real or is this fake? The lenses that we've created focus less on the content and more on human behavior, which is what those folks who create dis, and malinformation are also banking on. People who create suspicious or false content and share it online are making a prediction that we're going to react a certain way to their content. And so we have to be better at understanding what they're hoping we will do and being able to manage those reactions. And our lenses focus a lot on that, as opposed to a checklist where we try to look for, the hidden clues that a content creator is going to leave within their work to say, hey, this can't be trusted, because those are few and far between.
Yeah, it strikes me.
Drew,
go ahead.
Drew, can I add just one more thing? And Jennifer said, making a prediction, and the differences between, let's say, the 1920s advertiser, which is when it really got big, even though it was happening before that, they knew about humans to a certain extent, but we now have massive amounts of data, and we understand exactly what triggers people. We understand exactly how to get them to interact and make them angry or join our cause or whatever. And so they're highly sophisticated in knowing how to trigger us. And so I wanted to add that.
Yeah, well, it strikes me kind of the way that you're talking about it makes me think that we're kind of thinking similarly, is that we, as media consumers, whether that's social media or news media or any media really, but those are maybe the two big ones, social and quote-unquote news media, which has lots of layers of how we define news media, of course. Mm-hmm. But that we are best served perhaps to enter into I suppose, that relationship with that piece of media with a sort of I'll use the word lens as well, or a layer of that's sort of metacognitive, right? Of not just looking at the piece itself, but looking at the piece and using what are the motives, what are the things that they're doing, like who is the source, and how credible are they, what are the other things that they say that may be contradictory. And for me, one of the things that I look at is, their sort of commitment to a process, and the sense of inquiry, and willing to even be critical of their own ideas and thoughts, versus being, when we talk about media, news media, partisan media is somewhat synonymous with news media, and that's an unfortunate reality that we can get into. But you use the terms mis, dis, and malinformation, and I'm familiar with them from other contexts. And one of the books that I have recommended to all kinds of people, educators certainly, is Jonathan Rauch's Constitution of Knowledge, and he talks about mis and disinformation. I don't think he talks about malinformation in that book, but I've heard that term as well. How are you defining those sort of three categories of information?
Well, Drew, I'm going to answer your question first, but first I want to go back and touch on something you said, and that is about the partisan media. We live in a world where we've all decided that we don't want to pay for information anymore. And I don't have the statistic in front of me, but I'm going to get pretty close. If this isn't exact, it's pretty close. There's something like only around 40% of the independent journalistic news outlets that existed in the year 2000, only about 40% of them still exist now. And that has everything to do with the fact that we no longer pay for information anymore. And what that means is that every person who's creating content online, whether you're talking about a trained journalist, or you're talking about a internet troll, or you're talking about a social media influencer, or any of the others down the line, they all have to some degree the same goal in mind, which is that they need their content to go viral. We don't pay through subscriptions and ads anymore. We pay another way, and that is through clicks. So therefore, what content creators have had to do is they've had to learn to wear the hat of the marketer. And marketers have known for decades and decades and decades, as Darren alluded to, that emotional triggers are an incredibly effective way to get a consumer to buy your product. And so all information now has embedded in it some kind of trigger to try to get us to click. And in the book, we unpack the sort of big 6 to 8 emotions that marketers have focused on. We can see evidence of those in all content online too. And so we believe the key to starting this process to helping kids and adult learners think critically about the information they consume is to begin with the question of, how does this make me feel? And how do those feelings affect my urge to trust and share it? Because once that emotional trigger is pulled, once emotion has taken over, it doesn't matter how many checklists we have memorized. It doesn't matter how much we know about critical thinking. Once that emotion is triggered, it becomes the driver. And all three of us recognize that in ourselves. We've all come in contact with content online that pulls an emotion, pushes a button for us, and we can't wait to share it with our 240 characters worth of vitriol to go with it, because emotion becomes the driver, even for those of us who are experts. So with that in mind, the definitions of mis, dis, and malinformation are important to us because they really are a spectrum of intent. Misinformation is content that is shared that's false, but that is shared unintentionally. There's no intent to do harm. I'm a reporter on the scene and I get the facts wrong because not all the facts are in, say, during a natural disaster, et cetera. Or I'm online and I see something, I think it's true, and I share it because I want to inform other people, but it turns out to be false. That's misinformation. Disinformation is when I know the information is false, but I'm going to share it anyway because it furthers my narrative. Malinformation is when I have a hand at creating the content, and malinformation is specific in that it often merges together true things with false things in order to be more convincing. So I take a picture of something, but I share it in a different context in order to cause harm. That's malinformation. So it's a spectrum of harm. And so those definitions are to us because they can help us engage kids in the process of developing empathy, actually, for people who share or create dis and malinformation online, because that empathy helps us recognize their motives. When we recognize their motives, we're more likely to recognize also their work. Darren, you want to add to that?
Well, and in the spirit of, kind of sharing our journey and critical thinking and all those kinds of things, back to, if you notice fact versus fiction, we talked about fake news. We used the term fake news. And we actually had I won't call it a heavy debate, but a spirited debate with our editors, because we did not want to put the term fake news in our second book. And the reason is because over that period of time between the two books, fake news became the word of the year. It was used as Jennifer says, and I love it as a football player, it's political football. Like, we were throwing it all over the place. And it just was dismissing arguments, and it wasn't even getting down to any sort of critical thinking, back to that same kind of, real low level, oh, that's fake, I dismiss it. Well, this evolution of that intent, this calling out dis, and malinformation, was really intentional in this book. And again, it's trying to get kids to think beyond the quick, share this really quick because it affirms my belief, or I for whatever reason, want to send it to people. We really wanted to get teachers, students, hopefully parents, and everybody to drill down a little deeper than just that root emotional piece, which we know all this marketing, advertising, news period is built upon.
One of the
emotional link.
One of the things. So I don't disagree with you, Jennifer, about much of our sort of media, news media. I mean, everybody's got a website, and everybody's got everybody's a publisher at this point, right? And we're sharing, and so I see there's tons and tons of examples, more examples than not, of media that is driven by advertising, not subscription. But there's also, and I think this is important to note, that there are some significant players in that space that are subscription. For example, New York Times, they shifted more towards a subscription model. And they're not the only one by any stretch, but the idea, Wall Street Journal is one. I'm sure you all probably are aware of others that you could list off. And so it's not just a feature of to use a term that has sort of lost much of the meaning that it used to, left versus right, but just to use that as a proxy for something that used to make sense, at least. The idea that, or one of the concepts that I think is relevant here, is the idea of what audience capture, right? So these are the people who are subscribers to our publication, let's say the New York Times, and they want to hear certain things, they want to read certain things, they want certain kinds of stories, and so they tend to deliver those kinds of stories, which I would imagine, I don't know if it falls into dis, or malinformation, or just sort of narrative, and so how do you think about those? I don't want to call them outliers, because New York Times is obviously not an outlier, but is that something that fits in one of those three categories, or maybe is it a different category?
Can I add a piece, Jennifer, real quick?
Yes,
before
please.
You answer? So I was actually trying to look up a picture that while Jennifer was talking, because you were making me think we're actually right now seeing a shift. So we went from this massive amount of information for free. We're just getting out there, to Jennifer's point, like we're not going to pay for our information. You just give it. We want engagement. We want clicks. We want to build that community. We want to your point, speak to that narrative, or to speak to our particular groups, empower that, and build the tribe, or whatever you want to call it. Now we're seeing, because of this, because newspapers are shrinking, because these industries, because we have this large conglomeration, shareholders are asking for money, like all this, the economics of this system, we're now seeing a shift, which is it is troublesome. And it was awesome to have all this free information when we thought it was credible. And you could clearly see the difference between parody and satire and and all these things. And now we have this just cesspool of all this stuff, all this misdis and malinformation, truth is in there and all that kind of stuff. We're now seeing a shift to some of those publishers that you just talked about are now putting them behind a paywall. Mm-hmm. And so now it's become an economic issue of, can I afford to find the truth? And there's going to be an even bigger division, which is back to Jennifer's thing. These are big issues in how we deal with stuff. That thread is now, if I'm economically impacted, if I'm poor, if I don't have the funds, now I don't have options to get to the truth. Whereas it used to be, and again, I'm not saying that our old newspapers weren't filled with falsities but they were vetted. They went through an editor process. They did long amounts of research. There was a separation between a journalist and an advertiser, all these kinds of things. But the newspaper was relatively cheap and lots of people could get access to it. And so I think, to your point, we're right now, and in the last 5 years or so, you've really started to see this increase, this change. And then the last piece to that, we're also seeing a lot of side door media, which is people subscribing to what they want to hear through these like newsletters. Sign up for my group, do all these things. So they're getting the media that way. They're maybe on TikTok or something where their friends are saying it to them. That doesn't mean it's right. I hit on a bunch of things, Jennifer. I hope I didn't kill your thunder in this question, but
all of that. And I was thinking, because Darren and I joke about how we share the same brain and we just have to figure out who's using it on any given day. But I was thinking lots of those same things as Drew was talking about how first of all, I want to answer your question, Drew, and say that whether we're talking about the New York Times, which let's just say is more of a left-leaning editorially publication, or the Wall Street Journal, which I would put more towards the right, okay? I think both of those publications strive to publish factual information. And so sometimes they may publish misinformation and that they get it wrong, and then you'll see a retraction or you'll see a correction, et cetera. But I think they strive to publish factual information. So I wouldn't include them in misdis or malinformation. However, what I would say is that there's value in looking at even information that is vetted, that is edited, that is has been curated and created by trained journalists, et cetera. There's value in looking at things like editorial slant. There's value in looking for things like pathos, logos, and ethos. Those indicators that the information has been shaped in a way that is designed to influence, or to look at whose voices are left out of those stories, et cetera. All those things are valuable as we look at information that is quote unquote credible. Misdis and malinformation apply only to information that is not credible. So I just want to make that distinction. But to Darren's point, we are creating this situation. If we're going to, at some point, the pendulum's going to swing back, because what the internet has done, of course, is it's democratized information to some degree, but it's also democratized expertise. I can get on, create myself an account, put a blue check mark on it, and claim to be an expert on anything. And people may or may not trust that. Lots of people do. And so if the pendulum is going to swing back to a point where we're going to start putting some value on training and education and a process for creating and curating content, putting that content behind a paywall, of course, to Darren's point, creates inequality and inequitable situation, because what we're doing is denying credible information to the poor, to people who can't afford to subscribe. The same is true to a certain degree, and this is for a larger conversation about the internet in general, which is not a public utility that people have to pay for. And so even if the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal are posting some of their content for free online, you have to be able to access it with devices, with internet access, which of course we've seen in the pandemic in schools, is certainly not distributed equally. So all of that is a lot to unpack. I don't think we're going to solve that during this podcast, but these are important just conversations.
Yeah, there's such a number of dynamics at play here, and one of the things that is somewhat related to, I think, one of the things that you're mentioning of access, and that certainly is an issue even for people who do have means. I mean, I certainly can pay for more subscriptions than I have, but we have this sort of fragmentation of sources. You know, I could say I'm going to subscribe to New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and maybe one other, and then there's I don't know how many others that are, you know, sort of in that sort of credible space, right? Like New York Times sometimes I think has some trouble with the accuracy of their reporting, but overall, you know, they are somebody that's an outlet that and they certainly have had a narrative editorial bent to your point of left, and most places do, right? But they generally are a generally reliable source of information, as opposed to the Daily Beast or something like that tends to be very sensationalistic, and you can take it on out to the National Enquirer models that we see, and there's numbers of those, right? But so, I can't reasonably, none of us really can reasonably, number one, subscribe to all of those, either financially or just the number of things that we can read, right? So the opinions and the narratives and the sort of journalism that we can't access just for the way that it's fragmented. Then there's the other dynamic that seems to be really an interesting piece here. Again, it kind of gets to the audience capture of who, like the way that journalism and news has changed over the years. I mean, it used to be not something that took a tremendous amount of education and professional training. I mean, not to denigrate the industry of journalism, but it used to be a fairly working class kind of vocation, and now it's much more credentialed, much more professional. Some would say elite. I don't know if that's quite the right term, but there then is an audience and a relationship with the audience that is consuming and creating that. And so there's another dynamic there for kids and adults to sort of navigate and think through, right? And to do that critical thinking and say, okay, so it's not necessarily bad, but it is a reality in some cases that the New York Times has perhaps a bent. They might publish stories that are reinforcing the narratives and the things that one might who subscribes may want to actually consume. And so coming at that with that metacognitive lens, that is part, and I think your process, and we probably should get into the process that you have in the book, of how we actually sort of decode the information in a way that keeps us hopefully away from some of the motivated reasoning. And I'm curious, you sort of mentioned kids sharing things. I have 12 and 14-year-old, and I'm wondering how many, if you have any evidence or data on this, because I'm wondering how many teenagers are actually sharing news stories. I mean, I can imagine they're sharing TikToks and things like that, and perhaps there's some news or information embedded in there. But are kids actually sharing those kinds of things like we do? Like you said, I saw an article about this, and I'm going to put this in my 240 characters and try to get people to think about it. Are kids doing that? Yeah, I've thrown a lot at you and probably a couple questions, and I apologize for that, but I'll let you navigate the minefield.
Well, Jennifer, I have a lot of things to add to this. I'm going to just add a couple that you made me think of. First of all, most of the mainstream media, no matter what it is, if they have any financial means, most of them will somewhat segment or label what they're putting out. So if it's just a news release, if it's an editorial, if it's a commentary, if it's some sort of specific piece on the theme topic, like whatever it is. What we often miss, though, is especially in social media circles where most people are getting their news, including those very kids that you're talking about. They don't; those labels are not there. And we don't spend enough time actually saying, okay, what is the intention of this that's coming out? Like, what are they trying to do? Is there a difference between, for example, we've brought up New York Times a lot, but like let's shift it a little bit to the other side. What if we talk about Fox News? Is there a difference between Fox News business and Fox News opinion on the spectrum? There's a very big difference, and in a lot of these, because they're trying to play in different spaces and get, again, as many people as they can, they're going to push out different pieces. Well, as we're consuming this in these media circles, it's a few characters, or it's very little to digest. That headline triggers you, affirms your belief, all the stuff we've already talked about. Most people aren't getting past to the point of where you're talking about, where they're actually triangulating and finding out, or they're looking at the history of that writer. If they're looking at other past things that they do, because as you said, we don't all have infinite amounts of time to do this. What we're trying to get folks to do is pause and say, okay, what is this doing to me? Why? Where did it come from? Who, a list of questions to critically think about, instead of just saying, this affirms my belief, this fits that motivated reasoning you're talking about. I have, dissidents against this particular group, and I want to show hate towards them, so I'm just going to immediately share it. I haven't read anything. I don't know if it's true or if it's not. And again, I know Jennifer's going to add to a million things there. Wait, but I do. Let me add one more thing. Sorry, Jennifer, because I want to bring this up. It's also part of what we talk about. You brought up access, which is part of this, having everything in our pockets, immediately getting it, and the community reading experience about how the folks that we have, like we surround ourselves with, that we consume, how that impacts what we do. We do all kinds of different workshops with folks, but one of the ones that's at least one of my favorites, because it was a real snafu in me, who's supposed to understand all this, is I read a particular story that affirmed all those beliefs that we just talked about. And it was during the pandemic, and I'm not going to give out all the secrets because we use this a lot, but I immediately shared it with Jennifer, and she was like, and I'm like, oh, these people are so ridiculous, and I was like making all these like judgmental comments about how ridiculous they were. And then I also shared it with a couple of other friends. Well, Jennifer and I actually have a lot of the same friends. And so she took my comment and said, check this out, what Darren shared with me. And then they were like, well, Darren already shared it with me. And we were all chuckling about it. Now, the reality comes out that the whole thing was, I don't want to call it, it was a combination of, what would you call it, mis and malinformation, which was kind of weird. I mean, it's like this, it's this gray area that we like to use. And all that to say is that, like, because I trust Jennifer trusts me, we have these friends, we share these things, and I didn't vet it enough. And if I'm not doing it in that short amount of time, do you think that the 15-year-old kid or the 12-year-old kid, for that matter, is spending a bunch of time sharing it? And sorry, but I had to throw that one out there, Jennifer.
No, that's okay. I love that story. Drew, I want to touch on a couple of things you said. First of all, is that Common Sense Media does what they call the Common Census every few years, where they have a component where they collect some data around kids and news consumption. And anecdotally, my experience with kids reflects what Common Sense Media always publishes, and that is that kids do know about the news. If I walk up to your kids and I ask them if they're news consumers, they're like, no. Or if I say, where do you get your news? They're like, I ain't watching the news. Like, they don't identify in that way. But if I ask them about an event that just happened, they know. They get the information, and oftentimes it's by osmosis, especially the younger that they are. They're getting it filtered through adults and whatever biases come with that. But as they get older, they're seeing it in their social media feeds. And oftentimes it's through lots of secondary sources as opposed to a primary source like a journalistic outlet, et cetera. But they are consuming this content and information, which is why, we've talked a lot about bias during the last 45 minutes or so. And I kind of I wish we could reframe our thinking around that term, because all human beings are biased, and biases can be good. Biases can help save our lives, like when we are in a situation that may be dangerous, etc. The key is that we have to remember that all information is created by human beings, and human beings are biased and flawed. And so therefore, we have to, as consumers of that information, be critical when we look at it. That's one of the things that Darren and I have tried to do in the book, is to shift. We created what we call a credibility pyramid, which is sort of modeled after the idea of the food pyramid, where what you should consume the most of, et cetera. But we flipped the pyramid upside down to try to re-emphasize what we should focus on when we're thinking about credibility in content. That is to say that there's a lot of educators out there who still teach kids that the platform, or say the domain or URL of a source, is somehow a marker of credibility, which is not at all true. And so the platform or the URL, et cetera, should be the very least thing that we look at when we're talking about whether or not something is credible. And the same sort, we want to kind of de-emphasize the focus on source. While we should look at a source and find out what we can and learn about that source, sources change in so much as, we've talked about Fox News and the New York Times. Those places are run by human beings. Over time, those human beings change, their values shift, et cetera. So if there ever was a time where we could tell kids these sources are good and these sources are bad, or these sources are left and these sources are right, that time has passed, because we're living in an ever-changing and shifting information landscape. So rather, we want to help teachers teach kids how to focus on the content itself, and to look for clues there that can lead them to further investigation, rather than a checklist approach in which frankly, Darren and I talk about this all the time. These checklists are really no more stimulating to the brain than a word search. A checklist that just asks kids to look for and identify and circle something in the content. We want them to look at the content as a platform for asking questions. What part of this needs more investigation? Let me plant a red flag here. What do I need to, what should I look up in relationship to this? What does this red flag, what questions does this red flag generate for me, et cetera? So we feel like for us, existing information literacy protocols leave out our own emotional responses to information. To Darren's point, they leave out how news looks on a mobile device, which is where most of us get our information now, as opposed to the desktop or laptop, which is still privileged in schools. And by the way, just as an aside, because we talked about equity, we know that, and the pandemic has certainly revealed this, that most of our families who are living in poverty or without their basic needs being met at home do not have access to broadband, do not have access to a laptop or desktop at home. But what they do have access to is a mobile device, even if it's got a cracked screen and only works on on public Wi-Fi, as opposed to having a data plan. Most of our high needs families rely on mobile devices, not only for information consumption, but also to do schoolwork, more so than their more affluent counterparts who may have not only just one laptop or desktop at home, but maybe multiple, plus access to high-speed internet at their house. And yet, when we do information literacy in school, I'm not going to put a percentage on it, but I'll say most of the time, in my experience, we're still using desktops and laptops, and information looks very different in those two environments. Information on your phone looks different than it does on your desktop or laptop. Even if you want to teach kids how to dig into who the source is or when something was published, etc., finding those things in a TikTok video is much more challenging, or just requires different steps than if you're looking at something in your web browser at a news source, etc. So we have to think about in schools, that's why access is our second lens in the book, because we have to think about how the device we're accessing the information on might be playing a role in terms of our desire or urge to trust and share it, and our ability to really look in and investigate the content.
So one of the questions that came up as I was looking at especially some of the examples that you share, and because they didn't seem to get into anything that was particularly sort of partisan or necessarily controversial, shall we say. One question that I think is relevant in this conversation and in this work, increasingly so, and I don't think this is necessarily a good thing, perhaps, or more I think it's a bad thing, is sort of the political theater that schools are, especially right now with critical race theory being the pertinent example. So let me give you two examples that I would say, one on the left and one on the right, and I don't know that these necessarily would be things that they would be in schools, or this is necessarily the best examples, but just two that come to mind. And so like the New York Times and their coverage of the Central Park bird watcher, Christian Cooper, that whole thing, there's certainly been some reporting and some sort of follow-up on that about some of the complexities of the story that they didn't put in that maybe fit a narrative that we sort of talked about. On the other side, you might have, again, let's use Fox News because it's an easy proxy for the sort of right-leaning media, and the ways that they might portray and talk about and leave out, or the different complexities of what happened on January 6th at the Capitol. And so those are two examples that we could potentially use in a classroom, but both of those are potentially, to use the word, I don't think you're using this in the way that I'm going to use it here in the way it's used in the book, but triggering, right? Like those are potential flashpoints in different settings for different reasons and for different sort of narrative tribes, which are somewhat of a reality, right? You introduce questions about either of those narratives, and you very likely will get, depending on the setting, a particular pushback. It could be very, very, very aggressive pushback, right? So how do you think about, or any sort of suggestions or tips for teachers as they're helping students navigate and investigate and be digital detectives on media that they're consuming, but also, teachers using examples that might be somewhat controversial and bring up some potential conflicts in their classrooms?
Well, I'm going to jump on this right out of the chute. First of all, I think one of the important things you said at the beginning was political theater. Mm-hmm. When we wrote this book, and in fact, versus fiction for that matter, we tried to show all kinds of different ways in which different groups have used media to get to whatever their ends and means are. Political theater has always been around. Again, it's not going to change. I mean, we could show you broadsides from the beginning of the revolution where people were using political theater to try to get them on whatever cause, pro-England, colonies, like whatever. We could go further back, right, in history, Crusades. I mean, we just keep going.
Right.
We were very specific, although at the beginning of developing digital text, we certainly talked about January 6th. In every presentation that we do, in everything we talk about, we understand that the polarization and that politics is heavily involved in this. But it is, and we all have opinions and we all have beliefs. The three of us are somewhere on those spectrums, and you pick the subject. We might be right next to each other. We might be far apart. Like, That's not going to change the teachers' opinions, the parents' opinions, all those kinds of things. What we really want to focus on, again, is the critical thinking piece. And that no matter what topic comes up, no matter what is presented to us, that we look at what triggers us. We look at the access points. We look at what's the motivation behind those people. Because I think, to your point, I like to use it, it's a camera thing, but forced perspective. If you're familiar with forced perspective of, like, you've got that sun in the sky, and then based on the angle for which you share that picture, you look like you can grab the sun, or you look like you can manipulate the sun, or whatever those things are. These media industries and the apps and the algorithms and the bots and all of these things that could just go on and on a list are manipulating that perspective to fit their particular narrative. What we want kids to understand is why they're doing it, and pausing before they just jump in. And so then when we created the lessons in this book, so we haven't talked about that, like, we created it with the end in mind. We did the lessons first with the lenses in our mind, like we knew what we were going to do. And then we turned around and wrote the beginning of it. And the reason is because we picked lessons, again, K through 2, we gave lots of suggestions of what we would start with. Content, like you talked about, there's no way in the world they would be able to even absorb even 1% of that kinds of stuff. I would argue the next group is going to even be more difficult. I mean, those topics you're talking about is probably more high school, adult, and even higher ed levels. But the process for which you begin to go through these lenses, we think is an important process to go through. So then we've added actually mysteries in the book, where we're trying to engage kids in stuff that is I'm sure we can always find a political slant for all of them, but we think they're kind of apolitical. They're like normal stuff that happens out there, that you can get kids to investigate so they can understand and dissect the process, less than about, we need to focus just on, the polarization of politics, or we need to focus just on, let's say reporting in science or statistics or whatever, or we need to just focus on, again, all those topics that Jennifer brought up in the beginning.
I would just add to that and say that we were very intentional to create what Darren just called them mysteries, and I'm going to refer to them as case files, because they are all set up as mysteries, cases for kids to crack, to solve. And they're all high interest, they're all, many of them are hilarious, in my mind anyway. And as a 17-year middle school teacher, I feel like I have a good grasp on what's hilarious. But we very intentionally steered away from anything that could be construed as political, because what we were hearing and what we were seeing in our work with schools and districts around the country was that those triggers, that content, as you put it, and as we do use this word in the book, it triggers an emotional response that makes people react in a way that often causes them to opt out of the learning. And whether that's a literal opt out, I don't want my kids to be a part of this, opt out, or I'm just going to shut down and not listen because I have opinions about this. Those types of stories cause such a strong reaction that we're unable to absorb the real learning and the content there. And so we, as in response to what we heard teachers and librarians and administrators saying, created lessons that our hope is will help kids sharpen skills that then they can apply to all content, not just news, quote unquote news, or the political theater they've been talking about, but also the memes that are shared with them and the TikTok videos that challenge them to destroy school bathrooms and all of those other things. We want them to be applied to all content. One thing I want to just quickly say is that Darren and I were very intentional to create our 4 lenses in a way that while we present them linearly, because we believe that the triggers lens is sort of the foundation of all of it, that triggers lens, which is heavily embedded with SEL, with social emotional learning, that triggers lens is the foundation for everything. While we present them in a linear way to help educators learn them and understand them, we do not expect kids to apply them in any sort of linear way, or that every lens would be applied to every single piece of information. Rather, these lenses are levers really to help sharpen kids' skills. And the hope is that kids become adept at, and it becomes a habit in their mind of identifying red flags in content, that they will just automatically have the skill to deal with whatever that red flag is, whatever that content red flag is, as opposed to trying to remember, okay, what lens is this and what am I supposed to do with that? We don't want kids to, I don't know if the kids will ever even learn the lenses, maybe they will, but that's not the goal. The goal isn't for kids to learn the lenses. The goal is for kids to develop these skills.
Yeah, and I would imagine, so the 4 lenses are, we've mentioned them, so triggers, access, and forensics, which we haven't talked much about, and then the 4th one, motives. I would imagine the motives is, if I'm a teacher trying to use this, and I am in favor of and think that teachers, when they know how to do this well, can actually use controversial things, and I did on occasion, but you have to set that up, and you have to preface it with some sort of ground rules and things like that. But motives is part of that, right? Like, let's examine the motives of the author. Let's examine our own motives and our own sort of ideological beliefs, or what you think is your tribe, and those kinds of things. Because I think while information, dis, and malinformation is certainly a part of that, one of the things that is there's some sort of Venn diagram here, right, of sort of the us versus them kind of dynamic of tribalism, and that has made it harder, it's part of the political theater, to have some of those conversations. And the only way we learn how to have those conversations is to actually have those conversations and do them well. And this kind of content is great for that. Now, I'm not advocating for every teacher to pick the most controversial thing and let's examine it, and repeat, rinse. But I do think that there's got to be a role in education in having and de-escalating some of those conversations. But it does take some skill, and how we do that is it's perhaps a lost art. So,
well, Drew, I don't want to be dismissive. I don't want to say to you that we did this book and that you can't talk about controversial issues.
No,
that's not what we're saying at all.
No.
We're talking about that building the foundation before you jump into those.
Yeah.
So, like, I'll tell you a hilarious story about my oldest son. So I told you I was a former social studies teacher, and whether he liked it or not, he got a bunch of history early in his life, especially when we would go on camping trips. I would show the century, or we would have discussions about history and things like that. And one of the things that he said in class to one of his teachers when they were studying World War II, and this is when he was really, this part of it was like 6th grade. He said, Hitler was a really good leader. And the teacher went nuts and flipped out, and we got a call and went on this whole thing. And once he found out how it was perceived by people, he was mortified. He was like, oh my God, that's not what I meant. But he didn't have the words to explain it. And again, I'm being real binary and like cut and dry. What he meant by it was his ability to move the country of Germany, to do all of these kinds of things in a short amount of time.
Right.
What he did not mean was the Holocaust was good, or that how he treated human beings, like all those. He was talking about merely from a communication lens. And so we were able to have a nuanced discussion about different aspects of things, that it wasn't just, Hitler's like the root of all evil. Whenever we say anything online or whatever, it's like, well, you're like Hitler. And with good reason, in my opinion. But as a kid processes information, he's looking at like, well, what are different angles that they look at? So we could talk about all kinds of pieces of history where, a particular group glams onto it, makes it media. I mean, again, when we were growing up, it was the advisory sticker on hip hop albums, or, whatever. And it was the moral majority was like trying to stamp, we can't have this stuff. And we've moved down the road. You pick the line of political spectrum that's picking the topic that they're focused on. That's not going to change. And so that's why Jennifer and I are trying to focus on what's the nuances here? How do we build the foundation? How do we look at other resources, not just whatever the new thing is? We have to talk about it. At the same time, as you brought it, good teachers bring up current events when they can, that fits with the subject matter that they do. And you have to be able to set that foundation of how you talk about these things, and how's it make you feel?
Yeah.
I want to add to that and say that one thing that Darren and I are proud of in this book is that it only contains one URL. And we learned that lesson from our first book, where by the time went to publish, there were already broken links in it, right? And so we only included one URL, and that's to a website that we designed and created called the Evidence Locker. And we like to think of the book as, we use a cooking metaphor, like the book is the recipes and the evidence locker is the pantry. So the lesson plans in the book will give you the method, like this is the steps, but then the evidence locker gives you all of the ingredients that you need to either create the recipe exactly as we've written it, or you can add and pick and choose from the evidence locker to create a lesson that works best for your learners. One thing that we're very explicit about in the book is that we consider our lesson plans to be scaffolds for the teacher, in so much as use them as they are until you understand the methodology, but then you create and make them better because you know your learners better than we do. Like all scaffolds are meant to come down. We don't use scaffold to paint our house and then leave it up there because it's so great, right? Scaffolds are there to help you reach something that you can't reach to begin with. So to your point, Drew, we actually encourage educators in the book to take the case file template and to adapt it to stories and to content that works for their kids. What we wanted in the entry point for the book was to make sure that we were inviting everyone to the party. We didn't want anyone to read our book, feel triggered by the content, or fearful of using that content with their kids, and so therefore not participate. So we chose to use very benign content with then the encouragement for teachers to then replace that content with stuff that as they feel more comfortable using in their classes.
Yeah, and again, we've talked about briefly the lenses, and I don't want to give too much away because folks should get the book and read it and use it. There's also in the lessons, and again, elementary, middle, and high school, which can be modified for any level, I think you say in all of the examples, but and some QR codes that go to the evidence locker that you're referring to. So the 10 steps, and correct me if I'm using the language in misinformation here or malinformation or whatever, but process, the step 2, guided practice, and so an initial hypothesis, which is near and dear to my heart, so the inquiry process, right, and the application of liberal science, which is what I would say is what we should be insisting on in our schools. 3, guided practice and looking at the case file, assessment, step 4, 5, a whole group debrief, and 6, solution. So reveal the facts of the case, and then synthesis, step 7, reflection, step 8, 9, scaffolds, and then 10, potential extensions. So any sort of elevator pitch, reflection you want to say about those? I'm mindful of time, and so obviously we could talk in depth about those, but what's the sort of elevator pitch for that process that you would share with teachers?
I would just say that the last two, the scaffolds and extensions, of course, are to be applied in a differentiated way based on student need, but that those first 8 are really just the foundations, as you mentioned, of solid inquiry-based learning. And so we just wanted to create the case files and the lessons to model what good teachers are already doing, which is inquiry-based, begin with the end in mind sort of lesson, practice. And so we didn't want to create something that looked unfamiliar. We used that terminology because we felt most educators would be familiar with it. But all of it is very adaptable. And I think also from the feedback we've gotten is that the cases are super high interest for kids. They're intrigued by these stories and they're fun and goofy. And that's what we want. We've tried to create sticky learning experiences for kids so that therefore they'd be able to apply these skills beyond just the day or two that the lesson is going on.
Okay.
Darren, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, the only other part I would add is this was our inspiration. This was what we tried to do, again, to Jennifer's point, create these sticky, interesting, like Mike Caulfield talks about that, like a lot of times on the internet now, we get transported into some place with no context and no idea. We wanted to give them an interesting case that's the same thing where they have to build that hypothesis. They think like, well, what is this? Where's it go? Ask the questions, begin to build it, give the teachers some background information so they can do, to your point, set the stage to make this conversation work and get that thinking going, and then push them forward. But then what we're hoping, what I guess is at least in my mind is a dream, and I know Jennifer believes it as well, is like we want to create this digital detective squad that takes these ideas that we have and then build their own cases, like make their own mysteries, have kids involved, and share it with other people so we can get this thing moving instead of it just being the hub in 1 month or 1 week or whatever. We want, I mean, this is all embedded in all of the curriculum that we teach. The threads are there. We just have to have a collected effort that this is an important thing to teach. Every bit is, I mean, we talk about literacy all the time. Well, this is literacy. Like this is one of the main ones, in my opinion, especially as we move into the future of how we're going to be connected and what we're going to do. And so this was our attempt to cast the die.
All right, well, the book is Developing Digital Detectives, Essential Lessons for Discerning Fact From Fiction in the Fake News Era. I imagine you have some places you would like them to visit and go and find the book and so on and so forth. So now's the time to share those.
Well, I'll just say that the book be purchased anywhere that people purchase books. And of course, Darren and I are big fans of independent booksellers. So wherever you purchase books, you can buy it there. However, if you're interested in an ebook copy or you are interested in getting an ISTE membership discount, you can purchase it directly from ISTE for a discounted price. We also know that it's available at a lot of public libraries and on the service Scribd if you subscribe there. And honestly, Darren and I joke all the time about how we make about 11 cents per book and we have to share that. So neither of us are interested in, we're not hopeful that we're going to pay off our mortgage with this book. We want you to have the book. So wherever you can find it, please do that. And we hope that will also include connecting with us on social media. We use the hashtag Digital Detective Squad, which is outlined in the book, as also a resource for people to share information and to get updates about what we're doing and more goodies like that.
Okay. Darren, anything you want to share?
No, as always, Jennifer rocks. That was fantastic.
Okay. Do you mentioned social media? What are what are those? I suppose handles or whatever.
I'm D Hudgins on Twitter and Instagram, but if you look up our names or my name for particular, I won't speak for Jennifer. You'll be able to find us.
And I'm at Jennifer LaGarde on Twitter, but my Instagram is different. It's Jen LaGarde because someone had already taken my full name.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for the conversation, and certainly something that I think that librarians and teachers can benefit from, so I'd encourage them to get it. The practical applications being important ones, but also just a sort of overall mindset and the ways in which we think about media, think about sources, think about even primary sources and historical sources. Some of the same kinds of processes could be applied. So I do appreciate the conversation.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Drew, and thank TeachThought. We appreciate it.